It's very nice to be here and to see all of you here ready, willing and able to listen to what I've got to say. I will say that lots of what I'm going to talk about comes from a recent report. Sorry, I'm a bit of a wanderer when I talk. So, work done by, well, let me just show you. This report, which was done by a colleague of mine, Fiona Leach, Eric Slade, who previously worked for Concern, and myself, on looking at promising practice on SRGBV. And much of what I'm going to say relates to this document, which is available from Concern. It hasn't quite got its nice sparkly front on it, but hopefully that will happen soon. But you can see it's quite a meaty document. Okay, so although I'm going to refer to this, I'm also going to use some of my own history and experience working in low-income and developed countries, if you like, looking at issues of gender, power differences, inequalities in schools and society more widely. But I will be referring to that document, and if there are things that I can't explain as I talk, you can ask me questions about that at the end, and that document will also be available for reference. I guess my starting point is that it's all well and good to say this is an incidence of gender violence. But for me, it's really important so that we can understand contextually appropriate ways to behave, that we actually have a clear theoretical understanding, so that it gives us a basis to think for ourselves and make decisions and think and help other people think for themselves, if that's the case. And I think that's most important, giving the power back to the people in the context to understand what's happening. So as an academic, I would say that, wouldn't I? But, you know, for me, that is my activism, in thinking through and thinking about situations in different places. So let me start from the beginning, and I do realise that I'm talking to the converted partly, so I'm going to whiz through some of this, but I think it's really important. It'd be like standing for a political party and not knowing, you know, your political ideology or your manifesto. So in a sense, I do want to work through some of this, because it's the articulation of this that helps us to understand what might be best. So why is SRGBV important? It's important, obviously, because we're talking about human rights. We're talking about women's rights. We're talking about educational rights. We're talking about the EFA and MDGs, which actually mark out a terrain for action, a terrain where we can move and change things. It's about the Education for All goals and the Millennium Development Goals, and they are coming to an end in 2015. And as Bernadette referred to earlier, now is the time where we need to get active so we can do something about the 2015 development agenda. So these are really important because they're opening a space for us to say something. And of course, SRGBV is integral to quality, and it's about equalities. So at a very basis, that's why it's important. However, there are several difficulties and tensions. And the first lots of difficulties are related to definitions. Definitions about gender. Definitions about what counts as violence. The case that we just heard about in Kenya. You know, those children don't think that having corporal punishment is violence, is violating them. When I grew up, I didn't think it either. So, you know, and lots of us have experienced that. And, you know, there's a fine line about what somebody regards as violence and what somebody doesn't. And then how you work for it, how you work towards resolving what you might think as inappropriate use of violence. There are some people in this room who will think that all kinds of violence are out of court, and there are some people in the room who won't, who think, you know, the use of a slap here and there would be okay, for example. I'm not saying anything either way. I'm just saying we have to be clear about what we understand by violence. And also, even in the example that I've given you, I referred to physical violence, and we know that there are other kinds of violence that are much, much more damaging in a way. And we also have to think about issues related to the school. Why is it that the school is really important in addressing these issues, which are about equalities, they're about rights? Why is the school so important in addressing this? On top of that, we have got difficulties and tensions about the context, because we have powerful international agencies and bodies talking about priorities. What are their priorities? The EFA and MDGs came out of an international discussion around education. The fact that they didn't have anything about violence in them is indicative of the extent to which it was a priority at the time that they were constructed. So there are international priorities and discourses, and these sound different. They may be different from those at the national level, but we've got a complex power relation going on there, especially if we're talking about a low-income country, because they will be given conditionalities for aid, and one of them will be related to education. So the context is international, it's national. It's also about local social understandings and practices. What are the local social and cultural norms, if you like? How do we talk about and start to address those if we feel that we should? And then on top of that, we've got research and knowledge practices. The question about, often people say, let's put more female teachers into schools, as if that was going to be a panacea, a cure-all that will help us reduce levels of violence. It may have something to do with it, but we actually don't have the evidence to talk about that very well. Okay? And then, of course, when we come to the practical level, some of the difficulties and tensions are those that I've just talked about. The first one being, what do we consider as violence? People in different places consider that differently. Okay, so we need to strive towards a consensus. We need to think about a capacity to address issues of violence. We can lay the burden on teachers, but we do also have to think about the capacity of teachers to enact, to be able to act. And we also need to have to think about a strategic approach. And alongside that, all those sensitivities and silences, because we're talking about gender-based violence. This is about issues of gender, it's about issues of sexuality, it's about issues of tradition and culture, and about social hierarchies and norms. These are complex things. Many of them we're very silent about. I talked at Concern yesterday, and I was reminding people there of work I did with Concern, trying to raise the issue of school-related gender-based violence among the country officers in Concern at an international meeting. In that meeting, the officers who were supposed to be working on gender-based violence couldn't really say the word sex. They didn't want to say the word sex or sexuality. So in order to get them used to actually just saying the word sex, even if it wasn't in a sentence, we got them chanting sex, gender, sexuality, and it became, our morning wake up, let's start the day. So we were going around chanting, sex, gender, sexuality, just so that they'd practice saying the words. So we're relying heavily on people for whom some of these issues are quite strange or unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Okay? So I'm just pointing out here that we've got a range of difficulties and tensions around this. We can't assume that things are going to be easily addressed everywhere. Okay. My starting point, if you like, I've had so many starting points already today, but anyway, my starting point, if you like, or my third starting point, is to say, if our aim is in that centre, which is about inclusive education and gender equity, we need to have a theoretical understanding of policy to inform policy and practice, because it is these that are going to influence inclusive education. Now, if you feel like any policy that is educational policy, for example, that's produced doesn't have a gender theory, I'm saying you're wrong. It has an implicit gender theory, and we need to make those theories explicit if they're not already. So even where people are trying to address issues of educational equity, inside them somewhere, there will be theories of gender that are implicit. I think one of our key jobs is to try and make that explicit. So what I'm saying here is, in a policy, there will be an implicit theory of gender. Inside practices, there are implicit theories of gender. They may be explicit as well, but they will be implicit. So when we think about any policy and practice going ahead, we have to try and peel it back. What is it saying about gender? What is it saying about gender? Even if it's not a gender-focused policy, even if it's gender-blind, it's saying something. Okay, so I think if we are in the position of really wanting to do something about gender-based violence in the school, school-related gender-based violence, we need to bite the bullet. We need to say, where is it that we stand? Because even if we tried to get consensus in this room, and God knows you've come here on, you know, a late December afternoon when you could be doing so many other things, so you must be interested in some way. So even amongst us, to try and say, where is it that we're coming from, becomes critical, so that we can act without having to relate to a manual necessarily, but be able to think it through for ourselves. So we need to think about what gender is. And I've just put a few, you know, key words that you might think about. You know, it's a key social structure. It's how we organise social life. If you're talking on the phone to somebody and you don't know what their gender is, it's very destabilising. You're thinking, oh, is this a man or a woman? And I don't know what consequence it has, but, you know, you kind of think of it as a key way of organising yourself, your responses to people. Okay, it's a binary category, male and female, basically. Whether we agree with that or whether it excludes intersex or whatever groups it excludes, that's how it's used. All those UN GMR reports use a binary category, male and female. We use it inside schools, male and female. It's nominal and it's relational. So we're naming male and female, but what's important about it are its relations. It's the way males and females interact that make gender. Okay, I'm just putting a few words. It's about determinism. It means that once you're born a particular sex, your gender and sexuality are kind of assumed. That's about heteronormativity, and along with it come stereotypes. We can go into this much further if we need to. The next point I want to say is it's about being and becoming citizens. That's, to me, why this issue about equality and gender is important. It's gender as relational. We know how to relate to different gender groups. And it's about it being learned. This is important because this is the space that we can intervene. If it's learned behaviour, we have a space to intervene. Okay? It's about understanding your identity. Your gendered identity tells you things about how and where you can do what. So it's about place and it's about space. Where is your place? What space is yours? It's about the link between gender and sexuality. How do you express your sexuality? In what way? It's about performance. It's about how you enact your sexuality, your very identity. What is it? And it's about those issues of femininities and masculinities, how they are performed daily, how they are the things that produce the relations with each other. Okay. Thirdly, it's about institutions. How do we understand institutions? Because we're talking about schools. Schools are institutions. So how do institutions work? What are the gender regimes? Just like we can talk about political regimes, we can talk about gender regimes because they shape the relations that go on within them. We're kind of a little bit complicated in schools because it's not only gender relations that are important, age relations are highly significant to who can say what, who can do what, when and where in a school. And And so it's about power, practices and cultures, because you may have a technical description of what happens inside an institution, whether that is a formal institution like the ones that you work in, an employing institution, whether it's an institution of government or whether it's a school, there are rules of behaviour. And as I was recounting yesterday, I often go into, I work at a university, so I do some lectures, I talk to students, doctoral students, master students. And, you know, one of the first things in order to get their analytical brains going is to draw attention to the very space that we're in. So I'm in a space, I'm here talking, you are all good because you're all sat there and are saying nothing. You're not shouting and jeering at me, not yet. But, you know, you've learned how to behave properly. These things, you know, we get used to them, so we can't see them anymore. You know, I'm standing up, and if you were my students, it's partly because it denotes my power over you, whether you can pass or fail or not. You know, not exactly, but you know what I mean. But what is important about this, as Bernadette was saying before, is what happens to be the normal state of affairs gets created as natural. And it gets created as natural in a gendered way too. Boys will be boys. Oh, that's the way girls are. Those kind of comments. It becomes natural. And by that very process, it becomes neutral. There's nothing about it. So when you're trying to analyse your home, which is another institution, you know, and I know, for example, if somebody comes in, I'm staying at my parents' house, you know, if somebody comes in through the door, it's me that's going to jump up and make the cup of tea, not my brother. So if I try and denaturalise that, of course I'm a troublemaker to start off with because I don't want to make the cup of tea, or I'm a lazy woman or whatever I am. But actually if I try and denaturalise that, it's a very long journey back to say just because I was born physically in a different way doesn't mean to say that I have better capacity filling the kettle. No. Or using an iron or an ironing board. No. Okay? So some of these things that are natural, that are normal, really evoke something that's natural and therefore neutral. We have to think about that. We have to think about that when we're looking at institutions, and we have to think about it when we're looking at schools, because we are in the business of thinking, how could it be otherwise? Okay, so that's biting the bullet. Where are we coming from? Where are you standing on these things? Where are you in your theories of gender? Where are you about the production of identities, becoming somebody, a citizen? Incidentally, I've got a student in Ghana, Vincent. He's a Ghanaian, and he's been looking in schools, and he has been talking to young pupils in schools, and when he talks to them, they say, "Oh, I'm a nobody." So even though I've written there, you know, becoming somebody or a citizen, when you've got young children saying inside schools they're learning their identity as being a nobody, that really tears at you. You just think, wow, these are the lucky ones who are getting to school. Lucky, question mark. Anyway, so it's about, so where are you theorising gender? Where are you about the process of becoming a citizen? And what kind of citizen? Where are you in understanding how institutions work? What are the rules that operate within institutions, and how they are implicated by gender and by the becoming? Okay. I'm just going to throw this up. This is just the basis. It's saying patterns of gender and age authority relations position people differently in schools. There are power regimes that normalise explicit forms of gender violence. We are allowed to discipline children, some ways, in one way, another. It could be corporal punishment, it could be other kinds of power, punishment, discipline. And in many cases, the ways that the gender and power regime set up in school, it stops the teachers, it kind of stops the teacher intervening in the natural order. Boys take up most of the playground because boys will be boys. I'm not going to stop it as a teacher. I'm not going to claim the space for the girls, or am I? I don't know. There's a way in which the power regimes, the pattern of gender and age relations actually prevent some sort of action, because the teacher has to step out of the normal in order to do that. That's very hard. Okay, institutional power and relations are reproduced through coercion. We make people do things, either by the natural order, by saying, these are the school rules, okay? This is what you do here. And not only do we do it by coercion, but we get people to regulate other people. So if you're a girl and you go to school with the wrong bit of kit on, I don't know, the wrong dress or the wrong T-shirt, people will make fun of you. That's a form of regulation. It's about saying, no, you've got to do this. It's like when your mother, as a girl, your mother says, oh, Máiréad, don't sit like that. Put your legs together. Don't loll on the settee, put your legs together. That's a form of social regulation, in the way that she wouldn't say it to my brothers. Okay? She gets you to stand and sit properly. All of those things are about a form of regulation. You may think some are more or less harmful, but you've got to think about that. They are a form of regulation. We are learning how to behave. Forms of violence, well, that was covered. Basically, there's a list of them and people have slightly different descriptions of them, but the ones I've given there are physical, verbal, sexual, psychological and symbolic. And violence is manifest in all of these forms: harassment, bullying, segregation, exclusion, corporal punishment, sexual abuse, etc. Silence, disempowerment, they're all kinds of violence. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see that very well. What I thought I'd do now is give you a few insights from schools that I've been in, where we can see forms of disciplinary regime. And here you see a prefect. Interestingly, a prefect. A pupil, a prefect, disciplining another pupil. Just an ordinary child in that class. You can see that he's doing it through corporal punishment, or at least the threat of it. Okay? This is not unusual. This is not unusual at all. What's interesting is how the regime in the school has kind of worked through the age relation. That pupil is older than that pupil. He is named as a prefect. He has been given power, and the power to discipline the other child. I'm not sure how that prefect feels, but, well, not now, but, you know, you can see how the power is working through age relations within that school. Sorry, teaching resources. This is in the school where you say they don't use corporal punishment. And what we see, yes, we see the bit of paper, but we see the key symbol of teacherliness, which is a stick. Then we go into perhaps what forms of segregation that you might not think about particularly. But if we look in this picture, we can see it's a line, lovely line, people getting ready to go into the class, the teacher's there, smiling, I don't know. But what we see is the girls are all at the front and the boys are at the back. And when you talk to the boys, they'll say it's because we're bigger than the girls, so we go at the back. Well, obviously, that's not true. But, you know, the question here is, why does it have to be like that? Why are we learning that kind of segregation? What's the import of that? And another form here where you see young girls. This is Nigeria. And you can see girls here in the middle. Boys are all that side beside the window all together. Now, you know, at first glance you say, well, what's wrong with that? And maybe there's nothing wrong with it. But when you're starting to use gender to look at the normality of life in schools, all of these things matter. All of them are linked. And they'll be linked to the snippet of film that we're going to see a little bit later as well. So they start with small, insignificant things. Why would you bother to change that? Why would you bother to even talk about that? I mean, we probably all grew up where we had this as well. You know, you were segregated by gender for some reason. But, you know, it's starting there. It's starting there. They're connected. Okay. So, I'm just saying that SRGBV is centrally important. It's centrally important because if we are interested, God, I'm so want to go over there. If we're interested in the rectangle in the middle, which is about access and quality education, if that's what we're interested in, we know that if we go to the top here, that it's about equality. It's about equality of process and of outcome, both. We know that if we're looking at access and equality educationally and socially, it is about education, and education's big and complex. It's about schooling. It's about learning. Go on then.
She likes it before.
I like to walk around. Yeah. Does it work? Yeah. Okay, great. So what I'm saying is that if we're interested in this, it's about equality, about process as well as outcome, and it's about all of these things, which are about schooling, it's about learning, it's about teaching, it's about examinations. Importantly, it's about those informal processes, and it's about experience, and it's about spaces, and particularly safe spaces. So if we want this, these two can contribute to it. But if we have a deeply entrenched gender regime, they can take away from that idea of achieving access and quality through education. And educational access and equality relates to social access and equality. So when we're talking about gender, we can't just think about it simply because it's about sex, it's about gender, it's about sexuality, it's about intersections of the way that gender interacts with ethnicity, with religion, with poverty. So gender isn't simple, it's still there, and it's one of the main structures of social life, but it interacts with other aspects of identity. And on the other side, if we have violence, all of those listed there, they are going to take away from the achievement of equality through education. So that little rhombus, I think we call it, is there so that to show how if we don't look at the gender and the violence alongside our aims for equality through education, we're missing something. This is why it's important to look at school-related gender-based violence. Okay, so I'm now going to just refer a little bit to concern, because it's because of concern that I'm here at this moment, and just to say that in the work that I've done with concern, and concern obviously in their own right, have always had a central focus on poverty, inequality and vulnerability. And then they, in their 2003 policy, they looked at access, quality and equality, and you can see how that led on to them looking at gender-based violence in their strategic plan in 2004. And throughout what they did, Concern were interested in gender equality, and SRGBV was integrated into that, integrated into their education programs. Importantly too, for Concern, they have this thing that's called a P4, and that P4 is very important because it's also looking back at themselves to say, do the people that we employ, are they all also thinking about how what they do relates to equality? So about program participation protection policy. So it's an ethical as well as a reflective instrument in order to make sure people within Concern adhere to some of those really important issues around equity. Okay. So in the beginning of commissioning this study, Concern asked some questions because it was a review, and the questions were, where have there been successful interventions? How were they accomplished? What examples of good practice are available? What M&E process was used? What indicators and evidence is available? Is the integration of SRGBV the best way to go? I want to go back to this fourth bullet here, because we know in order to make the case for any particular focus, we need evidence. And there's lots of people who think they know the answer to other people's problems and will go and intervene, but they will not collect evidence. They won't monitor and evaluate. We have a difficulty here because
lots of the time in people's heads, when they're thinking about monitoring and evaluation, they're thinking of collecting quantitative data. We know in this area of SRGBV that will not be enough. It's too difficult to be able to count it. It's too sensitive, it's too difficult. So we need to think about monitoring and evaluation in order to substantiate a case and in order to record, to tell us whether whatever interventions we've been heavily engaged in, invested in, have produced anything. Okay? So that M&E point is really, really important. Okay, so in the review with my colleagues Fiona Leach and Eric Slade, we looked at some of the interventions. I'm not going to spend a long time on this because it's in the report, but I have drawn out from it some of those things that I think are really important and can indicate where promising practices might be. So the Stop the Violence Against Girls is still in process in Ghana, Kenya and Mozambique, and they have a very comprehensive monitoring and evaluation tool which describes the project and also has intermediate monitoring and evaluation points. The main thing about that one, I think, is that it really focuses on the girls. So that becomes a question. Are we just focusing on the girls? And for that project, they are. Well, it looks very promising and very comprehensive. I can't remember how many monitoring and evaluation indicators they've got, but it's like something like 51 or something, loads. This TGIMP project, which is just finished, and it was presented in London a couple of weeks ago. For that project, they took a similar approach to concern in that it was holistic, so across the programme, and it focused on gender. There's been lots of work on violence that has not had a gender analysis. So although the work on violence is important, if you don't have the gender analysis, you're not really getting the story. You're not getting how it's differentiated. And USAID also had those two projects there, and the Sea Change hasn't finished its final documentation. And here you see some of those from PLAN, and that Learn Without Fear, which was referred to earlier. So these, and this one about promoting child-friendly schooling in Uganda, is another project. Notably, it says here that all of these projects all worked in areas where people already had contact. That's really important because it means you already have made some relations in the local community. In addition to those, there were others which were one-off interventions focused on SRGBV, so they're a bit difficult to compare to what Concern is doing. In the appendix of this report, there's a list of those, and they go through, media and drama interventions to all kinds of policy and practice interventions. So they're available there. I'm not going to talk about those because there's lots of those, but they were one-offs. So you've got to think. I mean, if this is you attempting to do something, is a one-off okay, or do we want something that's more coherent? And I think that's the question that Concern were having in relation to where they put their energies. There were common aspects of these approaches. They all refer to gender as socially constructed. They had a rights-based approach. They generally use definitions of SRGBV, like the one that was presented before from PLAN, which are around the UN definitions. Many of them had multi-level approaches, so they didn't just go in at the school. They were trying to go in at policy, government level, to go in at meso level, and to go in at micro level, so either local level, regional level, and then into the school level. So they had multi-level approaches to addressing SRGBV, and you might think about the comparison of that to one-offs if you're going to do something. where would you put your energy? Importantly too, they had mixed methodology, so it means that they had a combination of data collection and project activities, because I don't think we're in the business of not knowing the effects of work we do. And they had the mix of qualitative and quantitative data, and they used a participatory and inclusive approach. So these are the commonalities across the approaches of those three main other agencies working in this field. They also had 5 intended outcomes, quickly though, through. One is a legal and policy framework. The second one was to improve prevention and response. The next one was to increase awareness. And this difficult thing of attitude and behaviour change, we can talk about that a little bit more, but there's a tendency to think that once you've changed an attitude or a reported attitude that you change behaviour. They're not necessarily linked. Evidence about that is very difficult to get. So you can get somebody, for example, who fills in a questionnaire at the beginning of a project and says, my attitudes about gender, who should be disciplined, is this. A year after you've had the project, they fill in the similar questionnaire, and it appears that their attitudes have improved, so they understand gender a bit more, they understand that they shouldn't be using most explicit forms of violence. But actually, even though you record that change in filling in a questionnaire, it doesn't necessarily indicate there is behaviour change. There's a slippage. And then issues about the safe learning environment and these indicators which are about enrolment and retention of girls. So these were the intended outcomes of those projects. I'm just going to skip through that because we can come back to that later. I just want to make 6 learning points now. From the overview of those projects and the activity that's been going on, I want to make 6 points about what looked like promising practice. And the first is that multi-level approach. Because if you have a multi-level approach, you're going to get a sense of coherent change. Rather than just being inside the school, if you're trying to affect policymakers as well, that's a stronger and more sustainable way to go. Monitoring and evaluation is vital. And at its best, it should include baseline, midterm and endline, and it should have quantitative and qualitative data. These things are very tricky, but there are some examples of good practice, like the ActionAid IOE one, although it has got so many indicators. I wonder if they're going to get reports on all of it. Next then, advocacy and communications are key. There are examples of where the projects did media watch. And media watch is quite interesting because you can start to look at what's reported in the paper. I mean, I remember being in Botswana sometime where a judge, a reported case, a court case where a judge was saying where a man had committed adultery and was being prosecuted for sexual violence or something. And the judge said something like, well, you can't blame the man. It's like a cow going to eat grass that's available. You know, just some of those metaphors that people use to excuse forms of behaviour. So media watch is quite important because it gets a flavour of what's acceptable to say, and also it gives you a chance to speak back. And also it raises public knowledge. It can give publicity to activities, so it gets into a general public. You know, the idea of this being a debatable issue is important. Other things were using technologies. There are some ways in which, particularly now, the youth, young people, are much more technology savvy, and you can use technology. We've seen it in places like Egypt, where technology was really important. Not that I'm suggesting everybody should go into conflict against the government necessarily, but at least you could see connectivity between people. It won't work in all places, but where it works is a very good medium to get people talking about something. And it's also important to get professional buy-in. So where teachers can actually agree with you about school-related gender-based violence, obviously that's going to be important. Staffing. And this means teachers, it means agency and organisation staff, as well as it does people who are working in schools. So it's about training and understanding gender and gender-based violence. All those things, you know, biting the bullet. Where do we stand on gender? Where do we stand on becoming a citizen? Where do we stand on institutions? If people don't understand that, it's really difficult for them, for you to then hope that they can enact it through their working lives. So it's staff training is really, really important. And I also think the idea that you have champions, I mean, people like to talk about role models. I have got an absolute hatred of the word role models. It's my own little, you know, idiosyncrasy, and we can talk about that later. But at least if we have champions, people who can speak about this thing, it becomes really important in sending a wider message about it. Rather than think you're fighting against public opinion, you can use public opinion to fight with you, or even to raise the issues with teachers about it. And of course you need commitment, and you need continuity. And it's madness if you try and train all these people and after 3 weeks they've left. I don't know, and I'm not sure, I mean, I'm talking about labour relations now, but I'm just saying where you have staff who stay, it's just like teachers in schools, where you have teachers that stay, there's often a better sense of the institutional life, and there's a better leverage on what they can do. And also, staff need to do something about data collection. They need to be able to analyse, use a gender analysis, and they need to act ethically. I remember one example. I was in Ghana. I was going to look at why kids were coming late to school or dropping out, you know, as a precursor to dropping out. And I went with a key researcher from an institute. And I said, OK, let's try and talk to some of the kids who are in danger of dropping out about how it's going, what is happening. And we were going to do little focus groups, because this big man walks right into the classroom and says, I know you haven't been coming to school, come out now, in front of everybody in the classroom. And I was thinking, oh God, that's not what we wanted, because those people are already under pressure. You're trying to ask them things to get them to talk to you. But if they don't understand, if there's no understanding of ethics, I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about me too, then this issue of data collection analysis becomes really difficult. Where you can do action research type of work, it's much better. Fifthly, voice and representation is really, really important. Part of the issue about the organisation of schools is because pupils don't have voice. That the student, my doctoral student I was referring to, who's talking to children who think they're nobody, is because they don't have a voice to say anything. And their best tool not to comply is silence and walking away. That's their best tool. They can't actively engage. So where there's no voice and representation, voice and representation is really important in moving issues of institutional life on. And in lots of places like the Teaching Project, work through SBMCs, SMCs, where female representation was minimal. So all those issues that may have been about girls' toilets, for example, may not have been on the agenda. All those issues that were talking about domestic labour at home having an influence on access to school, for example, were missing. So that issue where you get more pupil and female voice, or those people who are marginalised and excluded, it's really important. And one of the very successful strategies that many people have talked about are clubs in schools, whether these are girls' clubs, girls and boys' clubs, but it's a kind of informal space where they can set the agenda of what they're talking about. Some of them are even within HIV/AIDS clubs, all that kind of stuff. But where clubs are working, these are seen to be good. What their limits are is another question, but it's seen to be good because it's a space where people can get their voice, they can participate, and that's seen to be empowering. And finally, the sixth area where practice have been shown to have some advantage, to have some success, are about the ways that institutional resources are used. And this is about toilets are a big issue still, and safe spaces, toilets being safe spaces. Importantly, issues about being able to report cases of SRGBV become very important and actually quite weak. But where there are mechanisms, these are ethically important, but they're also seen to be more successful. And that relates, I guess, to the idea of having a champion, whether it's locally within the school or you know, regionally somewhere. Codes of conduct for teachers in particular have been something that people have tried quite a lot. And issues around the curriculum have been found to be important. Not only the official curriculum, you know, what the text contains and what it doesn't contain, what it misses out, what are the implicit gender messages about that, but also how the curriculum works out. The fact that, you know, all your maths and science teachers are males and your language and home economics teachers are females has an implicit message. So the idea of curriculum watch is important too. Okay, I'm going to hold it there. So I've just left you with six learning lessons from practice, if you like, that come out mostly out of the review that we've done for concern. Okay, thank you.
So, no doubt there's a question or two, maybe. Do you want to keep standing? Probably.
No, I can sit down now.
I don't want to force you into a space. Let's just go for it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was inspirational. I want to resign and come and study at your institution. Within the study, I'm wondering whether there was any differentiation between tackling violence very broadly in schools or tackling specific aspects of violence, for example, sexual violence, and whether there's been any learning on that particular aspect.
Oh, right, thank you. It's very difficult to say across the study, across the agency's work that we looked at. I mean, there were some that concentrated only on females, for example, and there were those that looked, let me just think now. Yeah, there were those that looked at more at sexual violence as what SRGBV meant, and they usually were about teacher-student violence, if you like. But as was mentioned earlier, there's actually a lot of violence between pupils as well. I can't say with conviction to you now off the top of my head. There will be something in there, but there were ones that specifically, particularly the one-offs that looked at sexual violence, and were looking at some of the media campaigns, the ones from South Africa is coming to the top of my head, and they were often related to the HIV/AIDS efforts, if you like. Within schools, there was sometimes a tendency to try to look holistically at the girl, so anything, but that related to what the girl was reporting. And then there were ones that were just talking about teacher discipline. And in a couple of those, they knitted together, but in some of them they were treated slightly differently, or the emphasis within the framework of the project emphasised one over the other. So really I think that the issue about sexual violence has come through social issues related to early marriage, for example, which were linked back into the school. Other ones that were about HIV and AIDS, which used the school as a convenient place to address issues of HIV and AIDS, not really recognising that schools themselves were quite violent places for people. And so I think I'd have to give you a specific answer
for each of the projects. It depended on the breadth of what they did and how they were informed by research or not.
And your own views on that? You know, it's such a massive and endemic problem.
Yeah.
You wonder in you know, advising a country or a particular number of schools in a country how to begin to address it, whether it can be a step-by-step approach, or if it becomes such a massive, you know, array that people feel it's untouchable in a sense.
Yeah, well, in a sense, you know, my beginning part is the connection between different kinds of gender violence. So the simple thing of lining up people who looked quite disciplined going into the class, you know, looked cool about it, to those things that are much more exaggerated forms of gender violence, because they're positioning people by gender into the kinds of behaviours that are appropriate for them. Okay, so for me, I see it as a continuum. So for me, that's where I want to start, because I want to say you need to have a gender analysis in order to understand this. Obviously, when if you want to start with the school, you're going to have to start and look at what those practices are and work from there, if you like. If you want to go into the community, then you're already linking more widely into familial ways of gender positioning, if you like. So to me, they're connected. And I think as an activist or an activist organisation or an organisation that does interventions, I think you really have to have a close contact with your context, because it is such a big thing. And I think once you start to scratch one thing, other things will pop up. And I think that's what you should anticipate and expect. And sometimes it's easier to go for the less severe thing that connects to the bigger issue. Bit of a vague answer, I'm sorry, but I think what I mean is that you have to get it into context, and you have to take it from what's in front of you.
Thanks very much. It was very interesting. All right, I have to agree with Noreen. I just want to bring up something. You mentioned earlier about concern having I can't remember what were the three principles: poverty, inequality, and something, whatever. We have a kind of a similar basis in Child Fund. We look at deprivation, exclusion, and vulnerability. Yeah. But recently we've been looking more at resilience and trying to focus on, well, what can the people themselves, in this case the students, the children, the girls, contribute towards improving the situation themselves. And I'm just wondering, is there anything, did you look at anything like that in any of the studies?
I think the effort to look at girls' clubs, not only to set them up, but also to look at them as a focus for being able to talk to each other about something, because some of those were girls-only clubs and some of them weren't. They were mixed, it depended. Some of those actually started to give some of the girls a sense of their own power, that they could say something. So rather being the nobody that I was talking about at one time, they had a sense that they could say something, that they had a space to say something. And we're talking about this inside lots of schools where not only is it, teachers, not only are the gender messages around how you position teachers, which teachers have got the most authority, it's even about prefects. You have prefects, so you've got little teachers, but you also have the dominance of the head boy over the head girl. So there's myriads of gender messages that are going through, and some of these start very small in the way that you're talking about. They start very small. If you've got a girls' club, you're starting from the bottom. But again, in most places you had to have more than a single layered strategy to address it. You can't just go with the girls. They're just not strong enough.
Deirdre and then Sarah.
Thanks, Máiréad. Just are there any practical tips, I suppose, in addressing the hierarchies within schools when a girl or boy child you're given your designated person to report to, whether it's your head teacher or your own teacher or principal, but the person you've been told to report to is actually the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Any tips on actually trying to address those power hierarchies, whether they start with prefects and go all the way up, whether you try and introduce some sort of board, but often boards are complicit, or even parent council? How do you avoid complicity? How do you address how do you address responses, real responses, to ensure the safety of children?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me the whole question all over again, and you know, I know that it's happened to me. You go into places where the very person you're talking to is the one that you discover, 2 years later, has been defiling young girls, the person you talk to. And you're thinking, so, I don't know, it's really, really difficult. And as I was talking with Fiona yesterday, we went to talk to Concern just as the Jimmy Savile thing hit the UK. And you're thinking, my God, I don't know, you're just thinking, and it's taken till now before people can speak. And this could be years and years ago, and now they're given the energy to speak. So, I mean, that's only hitting home to me because it is so difficult, because not only is there a silence around issues of sexual abuse or sexual relations, power in sexual relations, the difficulties that the HIV lobbies had with getting girls to assert themselves within love relationships. The silence is not only there, it's actually over the top as well. Even where teachers are found out to be sexually abusing girls, their punishment is to be moved to a different school. Well, we had priests in Ireland, the same kind of thing. So the punishment is to go on to a different place. You're hitting on a massive thing, which is why I think some of those efforts to not only work within the school and within the school community, but to work with the media that take a broader message become important. Because they're one by one case. You're assuming you're going to a place where...
I was just hoping you might come across maybe examples where a child, if they were reporting, would also be accompanied by another child, that they're not just reporting to one teacher, there may be a pair of teachers, maybe of mixed... I'm just wondering, are there models that have even showed anything promising?
I couldn't say anything that has been consistently recorded. I will say that most of the counselling type teachers that people report to are generally females. Now, whether that's better or not, I don't know. It seems to be less threatening. But, I mean, I'm giving you anecdotal evidence. I don't have.
And I think that's the big issue around, a lot of approaches haven't been evaluated and there hasn't been the rigorous monitoring. So even though there's various approaches from suggestion boxes to happy boxes, people are doing different things, but actually is that making a difference? And I think that's the other bit that almost needs us to unpack another day, is the whole, right from our baselines through to the monitoring, in order for us to be able to say, well, which approach, is having an impact, which approach is a safe approach, and every context then may be different.
Yeah.
Sarah, sorry.
Thanks. Marie, just two questions. You talked about the slippage between attitude and behaviour. I think we see that in all GBV programming, where people can answer. I mean, we see it in every walk of life, I suppose, where your attitude can be one thing and your behaviour something else. I just wonder, in terms of your 6 learning from practice points, what points to improved behaviour change? Or, is it a combination of the 6? Is it... it's one of those enormous questions again. And I guess linked to that, messaging. What kind of... you have a bugbear about role models. I have a bugbear about training at the moment, because I just think as NGOs we love to train and train and train.
No, I agree with that too.
It just seems to be an incessant training going on. And just sometimes the type of training, the consistency of training, the messaging and training. And again, I'm thinking of kids where work has been done on HIV, but what you find is kids saying, I don't have a girlfriend, because the messaging is almost like you're safer if you don't have a partner, but actually it's all going underground or being hidden, or you know what I mean? So I think learning from HIV programming and what kind of messaging works versus the whole blaming messaging or, you know, messaging that doesn't work, I suppose.
Yeah.
Have you, in your research or in your own experience beyond this research, looked at the kind of messaging that is having an impact?
I guess what we're talking around all the time here are a couple of things, and one is the separation of practice from research, so that we don't know what's going on, and we haven't really stood to analyse it. And that's partly because you see things happening and there's such an impetus to act that you kind of think, oh, let's get into it. Even the TGINT project started like that. It started as an intervention project and had the research put on the side. But what you're saying is also about, if you like, relations of power within the production of knowledge. So we could talk about the post-colonial condition, where, you know, as a colonial subject myself, you know, I'd be thinking, well, I don't want you people to come and tell me what to do. And, you know, I'm an academic, and that's safe for me because I can just analyse it from over here. I might go over there and think what people are doing. But where there is a need for act, and people need support to act, coming from all different contexts, that separation of research from knowledge and telling people what to do, I find difficult. And that's why I'm saying training. And I'm really saying training, and I really mean education. Because once you give people a way to analyse something, maybe they can help more positively to shape what goes on. And I know that everybody who gives money wants these outcomes. Tell us the outcomes, 1, 2, 3. And they don't care that much about the process. Whereas for me, and I can say it because I'm safely in an academic institution, I want to say, yeah, but what does it mean? What does it mean for people when you're doing that? So I'm probably the worst person to talk about practice, and I'm doing it because I've done research on it, because I've done reviews on it. I know how difficult it is to even do research practice. So I'm not really answering your problem. But one thing I did say, I asked TGINT Elaine Unterhalter from the Institute of Education, who was the researcher, well respected, at the end of your project, were people using gender as a binary category? Did you change anybody's view about what gender was? And she said, no. I can just say, I don't know, and no, I don't. Because if people are still thinking of it as the natural division between males and females, so that has consequences for how you are treated in the classroom and for your life chances, have we moved on? I don't know. Which is why, you know, again, as a safe academic, I can say it's really important to get people to understand those things, and that's why I'm saying training. I'm not saying it because it's easy, I'm saying it because it's difficult. In Concern we have examples of people who know that it, you know, they've got to be gender sensitive, but they don't really know what it is. I don't mean in Concern, I mean you're working with country officers who are also from the same, they have been brought up in a way that you think about it like this. That shift is really massive. Because it's about how they go home and relate to their male and female family members and the aspirations they have for their kids. It's about the whole thing. So, have I just slipped by your question? I don't know. I think it's really a difficult thing, and the training thing is really about biting the bullet. Can everybody bite the bullet about how they understand gender, how they understand the becoming of identity, how we understand how institution works? And that's not easy. But I think if we don't scrape that, you know, sorry, I'm going to rabbit for one more minute. In the UK, they were very successful colonisers, as we know. The British, with all the positives and negatives that brought. But what they did is they took education to places, and they took curriculum, forms of curriculum, the subjects that were important, the subjects that weren't. That may be good or bad, I'm not going to talk about that. But actually in the process, they made it very difficult for people to develop curriculum because people were harking back to the structures of the curriculum that were formed at a very different time. They, you know, and you go out to places very far flung and they're trying to copy what happened in Eton and Harrow, the big, you know, expensive public schools of 100 years ago, because the capacity to do curriculum development was not taken alongside the messages of education. So you get people. I went to, well, my birthplace in Africa was Kenya, and you know, I wasn't born there, but you know, that's my first incursion outside of Europe. I went there as a science teacher. I was teaching people about the buttercup. What was that about? So, you know, I'm just saying that there's long fingers on the end of this stuff. And for me, if we can get a theoretical understanding, that sounds all very airy-fairy, but it's just meaning about understanding life. If you get a way of looking at life, then, I don't know, there's more possibilities there. And I know that's hard in the face of the urgency to do something. I know that's hard.
Did you have a question?
Thanks very much, Máiréad, for the interesting, very thought-provoking, presentation that you gave us. And I have a comment and I have two questions actually. When you were talking about institutions there, I couldn't help thinking how they permeate each other. And I never thought of my house, as being an institution, but actually, thinking of it and having done a little experiment of my own with my own children, whereby this whole gender identity was not introduced, and the toys, that I introduced in my house were gender neutral. And I have a son, and how what seemed naturally, was attracted to cars and to boys' toys, but that came, from the creche. It didn't come from the house. So that interconnection and how it interacts was very, very interesting. So that was my own little laboratory in my house. But anyway, in terms of going back to the M&E question and the baseline and the whole baseline question, which I think is really, really interesting and very, very challenging, as you mentioned it. I suppose trying again to go back, to the practicalities that comes with it. I mean, do you feel that your bullets can provide some answer and some directions on how to address, the complexities of gathering concrete baseline data, whether qualitative or quantitative, and moving forward as well, M&E systems, because you are in a classroom and you are going to talk to the girl. So tell me, how she's not going to tell you, or he's not going to tell you. So, is there a way that your bullets can be incorporated, whether and how in the baseline and in the M&E system? And my second question is, again, going back to your 6 points, that you have made at the end, and again going back to the bullets. I mean, do you find that those 6 points actually address the three key elements of the bullets, or what is missing at the moment?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, well, I think the issue about the interconnectivity of family life, community life and the school and, wider civil society, because part of the publicity issue, if you like, or using communication is to get civil society denaturalising some of the things that they take for granted. And that connectivity is really important. And that immediately gives us a multi-level way in to addressing things that we think are happening in the school, because they're also happening in the community, or they're also taken for granted somehow. So that's that, and that gives us something. The bullets are not a framework for action. They are just saying, when we went through and reviewed what people were doing, where there were glimmers of hope and positive outcomes reported by people who were in the field acting. So they're not a framework at all. They may be things you might want to think about. There are some very comprehensive approaches, like the SVAGS project from IOE, Stop Violence Against Girls, it's very comprehensive. It's so comprehensive, it's almost unworkable, I think. So that is difficult. I think that we're in the day and age now that we're under global inspection. You know, and I think that we do really need to get our evidence to say more things. You know, for example, there has the example of female teachers. It seems normal. Get more female teachers in and things are going to be better. I can give you examples from research where, you know, the female teachers were amongst the worst people to speak against women. Either other women teachers, so as a, you know, a gendered employment space, and also to do more discipline to girls in ways that may not have been corporal punishment or physical, but it's about the symbolic, about undermining their very identities. You're not a proper woman if you don't do this. So, although it sounds attractive, we don't really have the evidence about putting more female teachers in, and maybe it will do something positive, maybe it is. So we are in a stage now where we need to get positive examples that look like the data around them has been systematically gathered. It doesn't have to be big data, you know, we can all do this, it's not like a big thing. Research isn't easy, but I'm just saying it doesn't have to be big data, but I think the message is that when you are trying to start to intervene, you need to get multiple voices, multiple perspectives on whatever you're intervening in. And you know, that's the biggest thing. And if people don't, then you can then you can understand the context, get multiple perspectives, and then you can say how something has changed. You can even get those perspectives into what might make things better. I don't know. And I'm talking again about process things which are very costly, and big funders are not interested. They want you to say 73% or 21%, whatever they want you to say. They much prefer that. So I think you need both. And I think it's really important, because if we are really going to move, I mean, I have a big feeling. You know, I listen to people talking about development. We've got the post-2015 MDGs coming up. I have got, you know, the absence of this thing about gender, the limp way that the MDGs actually did much in terms of gender. Yes, they may have got more girls into school, but, you know, some schools you just wouldn't want to have a girl in. It's not all goodness. And it's the very simple things that are easy to do, you know. Get more girls into school. Yes, stuff the classrooms full of girls. But, I'm not saying keep them out either, but, you know, that number is easy to show. We've now got 98% of girls in school. Well, it's not all that easy to show because data's not that good. But, you know, in general, whereas that doesn't tell you anything about how they're learning to be. Are they, you know, what is their voice? What is their projected future? So I'm not really answering you. It's not a framework for action, but we do need more monitoring and evaluation, and we may need to reframe the issue of gender in a different way. I mean, there are lots of things that are very topical. For example, the idea of democracy. The idea of participation is very topical. Maybe that's where we hang our gender hat. The issue around conflict and post-conflict and peace building, gender is really important there. Maybe that's where we hang our hat. I mean, it's also about education quality. We've kind of got half a hat on there. We don't really know what education quality is. And what we do is we count the number of teachers and their qualifications as a sign, as a proxy for education quality. But we have to be creative about the mood of the time. I'm positive. I'm positive in terms of gender. I'm positive in terms of qualitative data now being realised as the way that we can get to some of the things that are really important to change.
Okay. go one last question before, or
I just have a general comment. Mainly, you were discussing today about girls and boys and many issues surrounding gender-based violence. But I'm just wondering about transgender community who actually don't identify themselves as girls or boys, and where do they fit into this whole framework? Because arguably they're a group of people in society that actually need to be included into gender-based violence the most.
Yeah.
They haven't actually been mentioned today.
Yeah. No, in my reference to the binary category, it's inside that I'm talking, because once people use male and female as the only way of understanding, then transgender, intersex, whatever is lost off the agenda. And that, you know, underneath the heteronormativity, not only does things for those people, but it also does things to what a normative female or male should be like. And it's distressing, it's really distressing. And I didn't mean to leave it out, I was trying to nod to it inside the heteronormativity stuff and the use of binary categories, because it is also suggesting there's a kind of homogeneity around women and men who are identifying as women and men. We know that's not the case. You know, there may be more differences between, within each group than there are between them. I don't know. Point well made.
Anya?
I'm Anya Doody, I work for IRISH-AID. I attended some meetings last week organised by the UN Development Cooperation Forum, at which there was a number of presentations made about the plans for the post-2015 framework. And one of the positive things that seems to be emerging was and it's still relatively early days, but there was a kind of the issue of gender-based violence as a gap in the framework came up consistently. But the challenge that was constantly referred to as well was the lack of data. That if there is, if we do manage to get an indicator, for example, into a global framework, which, irrespective of, these global frameworks are far from perfect, and I know that the last one there were huge gaps, but I still think it would be a significant global achievement to have an indicator or a goal in around gender-based violence. But the key challenge being a lack of data, but the hope, I suppose, being expressed that if there was an indicator within a global framework that would drive, would be a drive and a push towards strengthening data collection globally around gender-based violence. And there was a lot of talk about a need for a goal, but also the importance of integrating gender across the frameworks.
Very
Obviously,
good.
they've read our they've all read
our discussion paper.
Exactly. But I suppose the first point to make would be the importance of, we've talked a lot about monitoring and evaluation processes, critical. I think actually it's about building local capacity around monitoring and evaluation processes. So it's around within schools and police stations, and say for bilateral donors such as IRISH-AID, it's probably around working with the national statistical commissions around how they integrate gender-based violence data gathering. So my question, I suppose, is when you look at the organisations that you looked at, and you referred to it slightly, but which were the most effective, I suppose, or what are the most ways of, that's probably not a fair question, but some examples of good practice around engaging, bringing their evidence to bear at a national level, and how effective the organisations were about making those links between the local and national level policy making.
Yeah. Well, yeah, all those points and comments that you made really valuable, and great. And my sense of optimism has raised once again. But I think an indicator is difficult. That reference to the bad training word is about that. It's about our capacity and local capacity wherever we're working to engage with the issues that we're talking about today. I wouldn't like to say which organisations were very good at making links to national data, a national will, if you like, a national sensitivity about the importance of this thing, because lots of them were multi-country studies, and when they write their reports, they tend to do the comparison between. But there are examples of where they have champions. They recruit champions from the Ministry of Education, for example, where some of them have tried to work directly with the Ministry of Education. But even then, I'm not sure how that works through Ministry of Education hierarchies themselves, the power that somebody in the Ministry of Education might have to do something. And of course, as you rightly point out, it's not only about education, it's about policing, it's about social protection, it's about a whole load of things. And we stand at that, at the dilemma of saying, okay, do we highlight gender-based violence on its own as something to look at? Or should I say, do we mainstream gender into everything? Because that's what we really want. That would be what we want. But at the same time, we need to reinforce the gender messages. And we get caught between those two, because sometimes when you're mainstreaming, the whole message gets lost. It gets subsumed by other things. I don't know. I can't say that I have examples where there was a really fantastic incorporation of messages about gender-based violence taken on nationally. You may get a reference to a report or an activity in the education report for 2010, for example, but whether it's taken up centrally is very hard to know. And actually, because there is very little surveillance and practice at the local level, we don't know how it works. So even where corporal punishment is against the law, corporal punishment goes on and it's condoned. So levels of surveillance or inspection or reporting or codes of conduct, how they work out into the lives of individual girls or groups of girls in particular areas, is still something that we find hard to touch, even if we got it in the international and national policy discourse. So.
Okay. Thanks a million, Máiréad. Thanks for all your questions. I think safe to say we're still probably agree that it's very complex. We're talking about gender-based violence. Although I think, having these spaces and dialogues to kind of unpack, even if you don't have the answer, it isn't like a process of growing wheat and put in A and B and you'll get C. It is really complex. It is grounded in social relations, and there's so many dynamics going on there, and it varies across contexts. But I mean, gender inequality is global, and we understand those concepts, and I think it's brilliant how Máiréad can bring us back to theory, and the light bulb comes on. It's going, of course we have to get those fundamentals really clear. And I think Máiréad has a fantastic way of complex theories and then imparting them in a really clear way. And the gender, sex, sexuality, normal, neutral, natural, those kind of mantras, with our staff, to make sense of unpacking what we're talking about is really key. And staff capacities come up, partner capacity. I mean, any of the approaches we're doing, we have to start with ourselves. And I think we really realise this around attitudes and behaviours. And as Máiréad said, we're working, our colleagues are from those societies, they've been socialised in that context. So we have to work with that. And even yesterday, we didn't even talk about referral systems here. And yesterday we were even going, oh my God, you have to actually start with referral systems before you actually go near any of the issues that is going on in the school. Because if you're working in a very isolated community and you're opening these issues and starting the dialogue, and then there's nowhere for somebody to go to because they're in rural Mozambique and thousands of miles from any kind of formal system, and that's a whole other that's a whole other issue that, you know, creates questions around what do we do to ensure that we're not doing more harm by addressing and recognising issues of violence. Anyway, I know it's. I think it's been a really valuable debate and dialogue. We have well, it's not that quick. We've about a 10-minute video to end on, and it's just about. It's actually from Plan International, but. It's a case of a girl, and it's issues around early marriage and arranged marriages, and that's quite, you know, a common phenomena in many of the contexts that we work in, and it unpacks some of those issues and some of the responses. I think it's just will be a nice way to end in terms of putting a human face to the issues that we've been talking about. And then there will be coffee afterwards, so just bear with us for about 10 minutes, and then we can get our caffeine fix and then continue to network. And once again, thanks to Máiréad for travelling, for Plan getting our second speaker, and for you coming along on this busy week. Thanks.